Welcome to the Life Illuminated podcast. I'm Maggie Kelly, your host, and today I have the honor and the pleasure of welcoming Lisha Song to the show. Lisha is an intuitive trauma therapist and an author as well. So let's get started. Welcome.
Thank you, Maggie. Thank you for letting me be on your show. I'm excited to be here. So this is fun.
So, your bio kind of says that you went through something of your own about 20 years ago or so that kind of shifted things for you. Can you share that with us?
Yes, I would love to. I was in the process of trying to get pregnant. I was 31, almost 32 years old. And after about a year of trying, of course, the medical staff wanted me to do a bunch of invasive, testing and things. And at the time, financially, we just couldn't swing that. It wasn't something that our insurance company was going to cover. So I just kind of went to bed that night wondering what was going on because medically, nothing has ever been outside of normal, as far as my cycle goes. So I had this dream one night, and in the dream, I am visiting my dying father in the hospital. And at this point in my life, I hadn't spoken to or seen my father for about a decade. And the reason for that is because he had sexually abused me as a child. And I did a lot of therapy during my college years, early 20s, and decided I was a very conscious choice to not continue with him because he was not seeking to address his own traumas from his childhood and to, attempt to repair our relationship. So I just stopped communicating with him. So this dream was kind of wild to have that dream. But in the dream, when I went to go see him in the hospital and he's dying, I presented him with a letter of forgiveness. And the energy was not of a daughter with her father. It truly felt like one soul seeing the suffering of another soul as it, passes through this life. And so that, I interpret that as my higher self in the dream, presenting forgiveness, presenting love to this other suffering soul. And I woke up from that dream and it just hit me like I have to go see him. There's something about not being able to get pregnant that has something to do with this dream and him. I didn't know what it was, but that dream truly felt like a message from the universe or God, whatever you want to call it. And at that point in my life, I wasn't all that spiritual. I was maybe more closer to agnostic, but that dream was very symbolic. And so I did, and of course, everyone around me thought that was not a good idea to go see him. Why would you, stir up that pot all over again? And I said, "It's okay. He can't hurt me anymore. I will be fine, but I have to go down this path just to see." Even though I didn't really know how all the pieces fit, I just followed my intuition, and I believe intuition is that divine voice within. Not that I could have articulated that back then, but so I went, my mother came with me, and it was maybe a 20-30 minute visit, and it wasn't necessarily eye-opening and dramatic or anything like that, but I realized he was still stuck in his own childhood trauma. He was very resentful of his mother who had abandoned him to a boys' orphanage, and that from that orphanage, he experienced physical and sexual abuse himself. And he had 3 failed marriages, and here he is in this rehabilitative sort of nursing home of sorts in a wheelchair, suffering with emphysema, type 2 diabetes. Yeah, but I could see like, wow, I was so grateful that in that moment, I felt so much gratitude for having done my own work to where I am not resentful. I didn't feel any resentment about the past. I felt a lot of compassion for him, maybe even pity. And so that was what I got from that. I I left there feeling like I still a little confused. He did apologize to me and he, for everything, quote unquote, but He'd apologized in the past, so that wasn't really all that meaningful. And then some ladies at work, I was sharing with them that I was having trouble getting pregnant. They told me about a craniosacral therapist in town. I was living in Portland, Oregon at the time, who was able to get all the girls pregnant. So I was like, sweet, I'm going to make an appointment with her. And then I happened to be reading Women's Bodies, Women's Wisdom by Dr. Christiane Northrup. And she says in there that she's an OBGYN, or she used to be for 30 years before she went into naturopathy. But most of her clients with any issues around the reproductive organs usually had a history of sexual assault or sexual abuse or incest. And at that time, I had no idea about the body keeps the score. I had no idea that we can still hold trauma energy in the cells of our bodies. So that was like, a small mind blowing moment. But all these little pieces, all these breadcrumbs are taking me on this journey of getting pregnant. So I make an appointment with the craniosacral therapist, who is basically an energy healer. And I didn't tell her my story, my background. I just said, I'm having trouble getting pregnant, been trying for about a year. And and I hopped up on her massage table and she hovered her hands over my body to get a sense of what the energy felt like. And she said, oh, yeah, it feels like your left ovary is blocked. So let's just unblock that. Like, no big deal. And so she starts the session and I have my eyes closed. And I've been on many, many massage tables. And they've never been emotional for me, but this particular appointment was very cathartic. I was crying on that table, and towards the end, maybe, of that session, I heard my reproductive organs talking to me. It sounds a little weird, but I heard them tell me, "We are safe now, Lisha. You can let go. You are safe. You can let go." And I agreed. I said, "Okay, I will let go." And 2 weeks later, positive pregnancy test, and that's my 21-year-old son today. So that was a significant experience for me where I felt like that dream came from God or the universe, and I just with intuition, I just followed those breadcrumbs. And the thing is, I didn't have any fear blocking me. I might have been confused, I might have even had some doubts along the way, but fear was not blocking me. And I thought, how many of us would follow more of those intuitive breadcrumbs if we didn't have emotions like fear or resentment or rage or profound grief holding us back, right? So that's when I started changing how I worked with clients to be much more inclusive of the spirit and the body, how the body holds on to memories, to trauma energy. And so now, when I'm working with clients and trauma, I include all the aspects of a person's being, not just their mental and emotional, but, my clients understand that everything influences health, everything in our lives, our lifestyle, our relationships with people, our relationships with ourselves impact either negatively or positively our physical health. So so that's my story there.
That's a great story. Yeah, and you
Yeah.
touch on a bunch of different things. One also is the ability for our listeners and ourselves to be able to trust that spirit has the divine guidance, not just that, but also spirit knows what they're doing. And most of the time we need to either both listen to what that intuition is telling us, but also have faith and trust and get out of the way,
Right.
right? Because
Right.
you know, I'm a very intuitive person and I get a lot of hits like you're talking about. And I remind myself, look, just get out of the way, get out of the way because you're being divinely guided. And if you just stop trying to cajole and manipulate and maneuver things and let it unfold, all of it's gonna transpire for the greatest good. All of it. It may
Mhm.
not look the
Mhm.
way I think it should or supposed to, but all said and done, it always works out the way it's supposed to, whatever it is, that is. And because this is the Life Illuminated podcast, most of our listeners are already on a bit of a spiritual path anyway. But
Right.
to but for those of you who are listening who are not quite there and you have a little bit of trepidation about believing that you're being divinely guided, it really is about letting go of the reins and understanding that if you let go of the reins, it's all going to work out. It really is. I mean, I don't know about you, but I spent way too many years trying to manage and control my life, and it wasn't
Mhm.
always going so well. Sure, things fell into place and things worked out, but there's so much less struggle if we can just let go, right?
Right. Right, right. And things work out. What I've, realized is it doesn't always work out to how you assume it's gonna work out. And sometimes there's dark nights of the soul, on that journey. So it's not easy peasy, roses and champagne the whole way. And I think that's what people want if they're gonna follow the divine. They want the path to be easy. I mean, I think it is easier because I like to try and listen to the whispers of the universe instead of the frying pan over the head, kinda like, "I'm trying to get your attention. Pay attention here." But still, evolution is not a painless process.
Exactly, exactly. And I love that point because, as a spiritual teacher and counselor and energy healer and meditation teacher, all those things that I do, it's always important to remind that client that it's never a straight line either. It's not a linear path. It's not kindergarten, first grade, second grade. It's more like a zigzag, zigzag, zigzag. And the part I think that most of the people that I work with struggle with is thinking there's somehow an end point, that there's some end point to this journey. And you know what? You don't want there to be an end point because then where would you be growing? Right. You also mentioned something that I think is so valuable. You said something about listening or following the breadcrumbs. And that's it, really, because spirit isn't, we hope, going to hit us over the head with the cast iron skillet for the most part, we hope. Mostly we're going to get synchronicities and synchronicities and synchronicities. And those are the breadcrumbs that actually confirm that we're on the right track.
Yes, totally agreed. Yeah, I don't think we have to have, cast iron skillet bonked on our heads if we're following those breadcrumbs, but sometimes we see the breadcrumbs, we know exactly what we need to do. Maybe we need to leave a toxic relationship. Maybe we need to leave a job that we've been at, burning out with for the last 10 years. But there's something that's keeping us from doing that. And I strongly believe it's fear, and the fear of so many things, but ultimately fear that keeps people from really following those breadcrumbs and trusting the process, even if there's pain involved.
Well, and the other side is also true, right? So some of those breadcrumbs are leading us to a beautiful new life. And that same fear is the fear that also stops us in that domain as well, right? Because
Yes.
I have recently just been like led in such an incredible way. One week, one event after an encounter, after another, after another, after another, a synchronicity over and over and over again. And the path is undeniable. But the path I'm being shown is going to require that I completely and totally reinvent my entire life. And so, again, back to trust and faith and understanding that you know what? I'm not even in charge. I'm not at all in charge. And that's the biggest piece, right? Is we think that we have all the control to do it all and make it all happen. And really that's not it at all. And you know what? The path is so much easier when we let go.
Yes, I totally agree 100%. It is. It is. As someone who loves to be in control and loves to plan, well, the universe, reminded me like, you're not in charge when my baby was born 2 months before his due date in a different city, in a hospital that I had not been planning, so and everything turned out just fine. It was a comedy of errors, but it still turned out fine. He was fine, I was fine. And that's the trust, like, even if there's pain, even if you lose control, it's still gonna work out for your highest good.
Yeah, and I also think that the roadblocks that may come up are designed to see where you are in this process. Not just, are you do you have the fortitude, do you have the strength, do you have the conviction to follow the path that you're being directed down, but also following your intuition. And I think that's the key, right? Is being able to really listen to the little voice that's always there and always right.
Yes, yes, absolutely.
Always. So talk to us a little bit about your book. It's called Love What Hurts.
Yes, let me just show you, isn't that a beautiful cover?
Definitely.
And it's not very thick for personal growth or self-help book, so hopefully not too intimidating for folks. But the book is really split into 2 halves. The first half is each chapter is leading up to chapter 7, where I have what's called the clearing exercise. And in this exercise, you learn this is very user friendly. You learn how to, through your imagination and through embodiment, you learn how to acknowledge and befriend the wounded parts of self. And usually the wounded parts of self are child age parts or adolescent, maybe even young adult. But it is that what when we can befriend the wounded parts of self, just simply acknowledging the part's pain softens the pain. Just acknowledge it's like acknowledging a hurt child, right? Maybe you come into a room and you notice there's a child in the corner, huddled, crying. And as soon as you give that child some attention, some acknowledgement, not trying to even make the child feel better right away, but just recognizing and validating their pain, they soften. Their emotions soften a bit and their increase of trust, happens with you. So that's the other thing too, when we learn how to befriend those wounded parts of us, those younger wounded parts of us, those parts of us start to trust us. And then they can give us information about how to heal. So that's the first part of my book. Each chapter is there's the power of imagination, talking about the nervous system, talking a little bit about intuition. But then the second part of the book talks about how we can start to listen to, and trust that intuitive divine guidance. And it's a lot easier to do that when we acknowledge and begin to alchemize those wounded parts to the whole self. So,
Sounds beautiful. And keeping in mind too, without the wounds, we wouldn't be who we are. Each one of those little
right.
scars and nicks in the nooks and crannies is designed to help us grow and evolve. I think a lot of us
100%.
yeah, it's interesting because I'm a meditation teacher as well. And, the longer you meditate, the more all that stuff that you've shoved down into your psychological basement starts to bubble up to the surface. And then it's like, oh my gosh, now what? Well, it's bubbling up because it wants to be seen. It wants to be dealt with. It wants to be looked at, not pushed aside, cast aside, and pretended that it doesn't exist.
Exactly. And when we get quiet long enough, then those parts of us will reveal themselves. Prime example 2020, lockdown, pandemic. Everybody started calling their therapists because we didn't have our usual distractions because we couldn't go to them, so we couldn't seek them out. And so then people realized in the quiet, right? That was a global, like almost global pause button. Like, oh man, all these like quote unquote demons are rising up to the surface. Like you said, they bubble up. and then we know what we need to address. But our society typically doesn't like to get quiet long enough to let that, let the bubble happen, so to speak.
No, we do everything we can to avoid actually looking in the mirror if we can, whether it's drugs, alcohol, sex, shopping on Amazon for things we don't need, overeating, stuff, gambling, all that stuff we do to avoid ourselves. And, when all is said and done, you're still you on the other side of those activities. And so the question is, are you going to stand up and rise up and face yourself and grow from there? Or are you just going to let the status quo be the one that runs the show?
Right. Right. And the problem is it's not, the status quo doesn't work forever because people end up getting sick, literally, and I think you're probably familiar with Dr. Gabor Mate, when the body says no, and then his latest release of, the myth of normal, right? That we are not, acknowledging enough in the medical community how impactful stress on the body is, right? If you're always a yes person and you don't have any boundaries, you will eventually get sick. And that is the body's way of saying, stop it, stop it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I'm an energy healer, so I work a lot in the quantum. I always say I dance in the quantum every day. And from a shaman's perspective, there's no such thing as disease. There's just sick people. And sick in the manner that our energetic body is taking on all the hits. And if we don't clear the energetic body, it will settle into the physical body and exist as disease. So really it behooves us all to take care of our energetic body and keep it clean in the very same way we keep our physical body clean on a regular basis as well.
Yes, 100%. 100%. And it's usually, it's interesting too, because when I am sick and I'm lying in bed and sometimes I will get some spiritual downloads because I don't have the defenses up. I don't have my logical brain stopping, those messages from coming through or overanalyzing them. And it is also in that rest, that we can connect with the divine. But we need to be able to get quiet enough to hear those messages, to really get to know our bodies and learn from our bodies, much more intimately.
And this, of course, is where meditation comes in.
Yes, yes, 100%, 100%.
Yeah. And, for anyone listening, you don't have to sit like a stiff board in the lotus position on a cushion for 10 hours to meditate. You can literally sit in a regular chair with your feet on the ground for 10 minutes. It really comes down to your commitment to remembering yourself, and I mean by remembering yourself, putting yourself back together. And the only way we can do that is by looking at ourselves, by staring at ourselves in the mirror and by confronting the stuff that hurts, the wounds that are still there and unhealed. And, you know, meditation is a very simple, easy thing to do. And most people think, oh my gosh, I don't have time. Well, if you have time to spend scrolling through Instagram for half an hour, you have 20 minutes to sit in stillness. It really comes back down to your commitment to sitting.
100%. I mean, we don't have any excuses today. And if you think you are too busy, I have a colleague who has her clients write down every 15 minutes what they just got done doing. And if you do that for 24 to 48 hours, you will see that you have 10 or 15 minutes to meditate. But if that does feel too intimidating, I usually tell my clients start with 60 seconds of just following your breath. And most of them come back to me and go, "Okay, that was too short." So I upped it to 3 minutes and I go, "Excellent." And what did you do in that 3 minutes? And they said they just allowed the feelings to just be there. And then when you acknowledge, then it's like the feelings don't have anything, resisting them anymore, so they just start to soften. So, yeah.
For sure. Yeah, I love
Mhm.
that little thought of I certainly would not sit and write what I do every 15 minutes, but I do think it's a really great exercise to also see where you waste your time, where you do things that are totally unnecessary with your time. And, time's just a construct, but all of said and done, we work on the construct inside the confines of that construct. So we have to kind of work with it as we go. But ultimately, you'd be astounded at how much you can get accomplished in one day, any given day, if you actually took inventory like that.
Right. It's like if you're trying to figure out, it's like doing a food journal. If you're trying to change your diet or trying to figure out what might be causing inflammation in your body, your nutritionist is going to have you log what you eat, throughout the day, and that is the most honest way of, it's so honest when you start writing it down. What am I doing? What am I putting into my body? How am I spending my time? Oh, I just spent the last 30 minutes just scrolling through through funny cat reels. I mean, yes, that's very entertaining, but, I could have been meditating. I could have been reading during that time. I could have just been, resting or whatever, sitting still.
Well, I think it's also super important to understand why we do that. Why do we take ourselves out of the present moment on a regular basis? Mostly because we don't want to deal with ourselves, almost entirely because of that. Sometimes it's boredom, but a lot of times we're doing things that just designed to get us through the day because we're lonely, we're bored, we got nothing better to do, and we certainly don't wanna take on the heavy lifting of taking a peek at what might have happened to us as children or young adults, whatever, that might actually catapult us into some sort of evolutionary state.
Yep, exactly.
So, what advice would you leave our listeners with to live a life illuminated?
This sounds very basic, but truly, no one can go wrong. You can never go wrong with a little bit of self-love. And I'm not talking about the emotion of love, romantic Valentine's Day, BS. I'm talking about the energy of fully accepting who you are unconditionally. So, for parents out there or people who have young children in their lives, imagine not loving that child unconditionally, right? You can't. Most people say, oh, of course, even if they, made big mistakes in their lives, they can still feel that unconditional love. Well, if you turn inward and give that to yourself, you won't make any bad decisions based on that. So,
Yeah, that you bring up a very good point. I mean, of all the topics my students love is and all the meditations that I do, the self-compassion meditation and that topic is probably the most requested meditation that I have. And we are not very good at being kind to ourselves, especially women, I think.
yes,
Yeah,
yes.
I think that
Well, we could talk about the patriarchy and all the brainwashing that influenced that, but that's another time.
yeah, that's another podcast, but yeah.
Yes, yes.
How can people find you, Lisha?
You can go to my website, Sacred Healing Place Tacoma, because I'm in Tacoma, Washington.com. I'm also on Facebook and Instagram under the same handle, Sacred Healing Place. So, yeah.
Sure.
Then here's my book, and you can find my book on any online book retailer. So Amazon, Barnes and Noble, and such. So it's only $12.
Well, thank you so much. This has been so much fun.
Thank you for having me again. Yeah,
Yeah.
it was fun. Yeah.